Hello, everybody. I hope you're all having a lovely bank holiday weekend and behaving yourselves, whatever you're up to, and whoever you're with, etc., etc. I've just come back from my dance class. I'm completely exhausted. Um, Now, I know we haven't done a bones, or I haven't done a bones ballot for a while. I just with everything that happened. Obviously, there was the pause in the general election campaign following the appalling attack in Manchester. And quite rightly, the parties took time out from the cut and thrust of the campaign to pay their respects to the terrible victims of that. I don't know about everybody else, but I was actually very affected by that. I really found it, yes, obviously any terrorism is shocking and awful and everything else. But this one really hit home as far as I was concerned. I think it was the combination of children, the fact that they were there at a pop concert, which is obviously something I've done a lot, and I was thinking about kind of going to the O2 and the number of events that we've been to there, and it just felt really, really distressing, and it still does actually. It just quite shocking. But life goes on, and I think it's good that the campaign, as I say, took the pause that it did. I think it's good now that the pause has ended and we're now back campaigning, because actually we live in a democracy, and for all the terrible events that happened on Monday night, we have to have the debate as a country as to what happens over the next 5 years. And I think it's right that that has been resumed. And I do think one of the things that will come out of that, beyond all the sort of cut and thrust issues that Brexit and the NHS, the economy and everything else, but I think the point on police numbers has got to be made. And I'm not going to sit here as somebody on the sort of centre-left of politics and blame the cuts in police numbers for what happened on Monday, because that would clearly be ridiculous. But I certainly think to cut police numbers by 20,000 at a time that the terror threat is severe, I think is something that the Cameron government has got to address why they were doing that. And it's not good enough to say, oh well, we had to make savings, because the first duty of any government, as we know, is to look after its citizens. And I mean, the sight of the army being sort of frog marched onto the streets, I really didn't think covered the government in glory at all. It certainly didn't make me feel more secure. It made me feel that there was a fundamental problem with police resources, and there was a sort of panic measure being put into place to try and make the country look strong and powerful and, dare I say, strong and stable. And it didn't really work, and I think the government knows it hasn't really worked. It's created this air of panic, I mean, raising it from severe to critical, the risk of an attack. I know that's not a government decision to do that, but again, that's had the impact, I think, of just making people very, very wary as they go about their daily business. And I see the threat's now been reduced back to severe, and I think the army numbers have either been reduced or completely stopped in terms of doing the policing. But I do think this issue of police numbers has got to be made. And when Corbyn did his speech, I didn't actually see the speech, but I read, and I read on various, I got the sort of Guardian perspective and then the Telegraph perspective and blah 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 to try and get a sort of balanced view on it. But from my stance, I thought, well, for the leader of the opposition to be making the obvious point that the war on terror isn't working, I didn't think there was anything outrageous or unpatriotic about that. It blatantly isn't working, and we saw the evidence of it not working on Monday night. That's not to say that Corbyn has got the answers for a strategy that would have prevented it or will prevent future attacks. But I do think it's the job of an opposition to oppose. And if you can't, as leader of the opposition, be entitled to say the current approach is not working, then I just think the system's ridiculous. I don't think there was anything wrong in him making that point. You know, whether he's got links with the IRA from before and all of that, that's a separate issue, and that's something he's got to kind of deal with and answer. But I think it is quite correct in a democracy that a leader of the opposition is making the point, the blatantly obvious point, that the current approach is not working. And it is the job of a government to try and engage in a foreign policy that reduces rather than increases the risk of terrorism. So I think when the Tories do their sort of sycophantic anger and, oh, isn't this outrageous? I mean, the best example of that, I don't know if anyone saw the Michael Fallon interview on Channel 4 News last night. It's been all over Twitter like a rash. Basically, he was there doing his usual sanctimonious and pious thing, saying, oh, Jeremy Corbyn's terribly unpatriotic and blah, blah, blah. And he was being quoted. The journalist was quoting to him comments, and Fallon sort of saying, oh, that's completely awful. And the journalist said, well, actually, that's Boris Johnson, your foreign secretary, who we're quoting, who's, I think the quote was something along the lines of not saying that the actions in the Middle East had caused the attacks, but that they'd certainly increased the kind of excuse that people can use for carrying out such attacks. So I think Fallon was left looking a bit of an idiot, having taken this rather sort of outraged stance. To then find that actually, you know, that wasn't a quote from Corbyn at all. It was from his own foreign secretary. But you know, the approach isn't working. It isn't working at all. And ultimately, I think with terrorists, you know, nobody's saying that someone should put a cuddly arm around the like of the guy on Monday and sort of say, there, you know, let's have a chat about it. But we have to look as to why people are being radicalised. How is it happening? Why is it happening that British-born people or people in other European countries are being driven down this extremist path? And to just sort of be outraged and come out with the usual platitudes about, oh, we're not going to let it change our way of life and all of this very worthy stuff, it doesn't actually solve the problem or do anything other than make politicians look like they're grandstanding, quite honestly. So we shall see how it plays out. I mean, I have to say, when the attack happened, as well as all the sort of human feelings and emotions and everything that I felt, I did feel politically it was going to play in Theresa May's favour, because I think it enabled her to look prime ministerial, to stand there at the podium and be suitably outraged and all the rest of it. I'm not sure, actually, given that she was Home Secretary and the 20,000 police cuts on her watch, given this rather confused reaction of raising the level to critical and then unraising it, putting the army on and then unputting them on, it doesn't look a particularly sensible strategy. And whether they're trying to look strong, I think they've got very confused, the government, between trying to look strong and tough on the one hand and trying to look sort of in control of events on the other. And they've somehow kind of got in a bit of a mess. You know, we'll be strong and put the army out, but then we look like we're out of control. So it's quite unprecedented. I certainly can't remember an election where there's been this amount of you know, what's the Macmillan phrase, of events, dear boy, events, happening alongside it. And you forget that governments still, I mean, I remember when I was younger, I used to think, kind of when I was a teenager, that there was almost a sort of unwritten rule in politics that during an election campaign, you know, the world and any of its issues kind of paused and stopped for 6 weeks, so that politicians could have a good cat fight and somebody could emerge as a winner. I've now realised that actually it doesn't quite work like that, and events carry on, and government's job is still to govern and is still to react to them. And in a way, you know, it's probably the hardest thing a Prime Minister and a government has to deal with, and you wouldn't wish it really on anybody, having to make these difficult decisions and look at security evidence that the rest of us are not shown and are not privy to. But I do think, in a way, Theresa May's been sort of hoisted by her own petard on this one. You know, she's called this election. There was no reason to call it. and she's now being really tested. And I mean, we saw that the day of the, or the day before the night of the attacks, if you like, when she was getting herself in a hopeless muddle with the Tories' social care position and the U-turn on that, and this rather sort of really shrill, sort of bad-tempered press conference that she gave, where I have to say she looked anything but strong and stable. So I think she's had a pretty awful campaign, actually. The Andrew Neil interview was pretty embarrassing. She couldn't really handle that very competently. Corbyn's effort yesterday, I thought, was better than I was expecting, actually. I mean, he did get sort of challenged very hard on IRA links and terrorism and why do your own party not support you. But I thought he actually, it was me saying it, I mean, the commentators who looked at it across the political spectrum said he actually came out of it not badly, which for an Andrew Neil interview is something of a triumph to emerge relatively unscathed. But in terms of the campaign as a whole, let's think where we started. We started with the Tories 20 to 24 points ahead. We're now at a point where, depending on who you believe, the Tories are something like between 5 and 12 points ahead. There's a poll out today that has them 12 points ahead. There was a YouGov poll yesterday that had reduced their lead to 5 points. If that was replicated in 12 days' time, the Tory majority would actually be reduced from 12, the current 17, to 2. So it would be a disaster from Theresa May's point of view if that happened. An awful lot of pain for absolutely no gain and indeed for some loss. Is that going to happen? I don't know. I honestly think we're in such a sort of topsy-turvy, uncertain time that I think it can almost play out in any which way. Almost nothing would surprise me at the moment in terms of how we end up. So let's keep following it. Let's see how it goes. It's very exciting. I'll talk to you tomorrow. See you later.